Welcome to App Stories, a weekly exploration of the world of apps. Today's show is brought to you by Concepts and Direct Mail. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is Federico Viticci. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm doing all right. You know what? I am really excited because, yes, we are recording this a little bit in advance because that's what we do, but we are using this show to kick off a very special week at MacStories, which is our celebration of the launch of the iPad 10 years ago on April 3rd. And so April 3rd happens to be a Friday. So we're celebrating that anniversary for the entire week leading up to Friday. And we have a whole bunch of things planned that we're going to talk about in a little bit. How are you feeling about the whole thing, Federico?
I feel very old is how I feel because it doesn't feel like a full decade, and yet it is. And I clearly remember the crazy things that I did 10 years ago to get an iPad from the US, shipped to Italy with FedEx, I believe it was. I convinced a friend to overnight an iPad to me, and I had an iPad very early compared to other Italians. But I'm very excited about the special event that we prepared for MacStories. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. We have a bunch of really different stories about 10 years of iPad, each coming from a different perspective. From the MacStories team, including one that I've been working on for really the past few months when you consider all the research that went into it. So we're going to talk about all of that in a few minutes. But before we do, I believe, John, you have some necessary follow-up to share with our listeners.
I do. And, I just want to make one comment, which is you have a very long history of convincing people to ship you technology from the United States.
Yes. I go way back. I believe it goes way back to the first members of the original MacStories team back in 2010. They were already, I was already convincing them to ship me stuff. And it's a tradition that continued, of course, very famously with the HomePod, when you shipped one to me by driving in a snowstorm to your nearby UPS shipping center.
I wish you had been in the car with me to take this to the UPS center because you would have been terrified because I was lucky that I survived that trip because
Poor John.
It was a blizzard. I was sliding all over the place, but I made it there and I made it home in one piece. So it was fine. And I was happy to do it. All right, let's get on to that follow-up because we did an episode, I guess it's been a few episodes now ago, about subscriptions. And one of the things we talked about with the universal purchases is that we were under the impression that it would mean that developers of apps wouldn't need to do the same kind of receipt checking that they were doing before. And that while that's partially true, but as with a lot of new APIs, it's not completely true. Because my understanding, after talking to a few other people about this, is that it's more of a go-forward thing for people with new apps, and that if you have an existing app, and there are a lot of these, and some of the ones I think we gave as examples, like MindNote and Ulysses and whatnot, it's not set up in a way for it to work for all of these companies, for a variety of different technical underpinning reasons that aren't worth getting into as part of the follow-up. But as a result, they still need to do that. A lot of developers going forward won't have to, but there is still both a need to do that and room for services that exist out there to do that for them. And it's good that those services are still out there and have not been completely Sherlocked by these changes. So just wanted to kind of clarify that because it's not quite as black and white as we had thought it might be.
Yeah, that's good. I think, if developers continue to have the choice of these different services that can help them do like receipt checking and validation, that's good. And I still have not actually purchased a universal app myself that is cross-platform across iOS and macOS, but I'm keen to do that as soon as possible. I've been talking to some developers who are working on these new apps that will take advantage of this API, so I am sure that we're going to talk about this again in the future as soon as more apps that take advantage of all of this come out.
Yeah, we will be. I mean, I have a review sitting in WordPress waiting for approvals, and as I understand it, the approvals are, they haven't unified. Apple hasn't unified the approvals so that if you submit a Mac app and an iOS/iPad OS app, they don't necessarily get approved on the same day. And I know at least one developer who's has one app approved and waiting for the other one to get through. So it's going to be a little bit of a transition here, but I expect we'll start seeing some of those apps as early as maybe this week. So we'll see. All right, Federico, let's move on to the iPad at 10, because as you said, we have a lot planned for this week. There's at least one story every day this week, sometimes two. And we thought that today we would talk a little bit, without completely spoiling our stories, about two of the main stories that you and I are doing. And the first thing that will go up on the site shortly after we publish this episode is a history of the iPad that I did. And the reason I wanted to write about this is because when, as people will recall, the iPad was announced in January, but not released until April. So the 10th anniversary of the introduction of the iPad, when it was announced, was very end of January of this year. And at the time, I wrote a story which kind of was the prequel to what this story is about, because it is the explanation of what led to the iPad. I covered a lot of the funny concepts that people had. I think it's easy to forget that going into the iPad being announced, there was a lot of speculation that this was really just going to be a Mac without a keyboard, that it was going to run OS 10. And despite the fact that we had already had the iPhone for, nearly 2 years, we didn't have, we had a lot of people speculating that tablet would still run OS 10, which I thought was really interesting at the time. So I spent that article going through that history leading up and to the actual introduction itself and what that said about the iPad and how that kind of set the tone and the stage for what was to come after that. And so this story is all about those things that came after. When you look back at the last 10 years, I feel like you have to kind of split it into almost exact equal halves. You have the first 5 years, which is dominated by things like the original iPad, the iPad Air, and the iPad Mini, and really a focus on consumption apps more than anything else, because very much like that original keynote, if you go back to that keynote, most of that keynote was spent demonstrating things like browsing photos, watching movies, reading books, that sort of thing. It wasn't until the very end that iWork was demoed by Phil Schiller, which gave us kind of a hint of things to come. So that's the first half, which I can get into a little more detail in a second. But the second half is the iPad Pro era, because in 2015, we got our first iPad Pro. And we've seen iterations on that now. We're on our third generation. And I feel like that's the transition where we saw some of the promise from the very first keynote with things like iWork actually coming to be in the form of the hardware of the iPad Pro and some of the apps. Now, it's not quite as clean, of course, as that, because, you had definitely people making, especially third-party developers, making apps in those early days that really were pro apps. You had things like Editorial and MindNode, a whole bunch of other great apps. But the focus still was kind of on consumption more than anything else. And it really wasn't until we got to the iPad Pro that things started transforming. And I'm not sure why that is. I think on the one hand, the iPad both benefited and suffers from the fact that it was so closely tied to the iPhone. I mean, it was an enormous advantage to the iPad to be like an iPhone. It was like a big iPhone to some degree. And that was great because people were new to touch devices. They had only had a couple of years to acclimate to that whole touch UI and how that works. And so it absolutely made sense to mimic what was done on the iPhone so that people could get up and running on an iPad really quickly. And I think that in large measure is why we saw so many sales. I mean, this was the fastest adopted consumer electronic, even more so than the DVD player in like the 90s. I mean, the sales were phenomenal the first 3 years. It wasn't until 2013 that things started to slide a little bit. And so, on the one hand, that was a great advantage in getting those early sales and getting the iPad up and running very quickly. But the software didn't actually evolve, I think, as quickly as it probably should have. And maybe it was because it was so successful, and Apple didn't want to jinx that winning formula by changing the underlying OS. But people started running into roadblocks in creating pro apps. We had an app focused environment without a file system that we could access. And it wasn't until those things started changing and evolving in iOS, and then eventually we got iPad OS, that I feel like the iPad actually came into its own. And, and it was 2015 when that iPad Pro came out, when we first started seeing, I think, real change both on a hardware side and on the software side that finally brought to fruition the promise of things like iWork. Because if you look at that very first keynote, those iWork apps are really impressive. That's the very first iPad. And you had these custom keyboards, and you had all these, Phil Schiller was showing how you can edit numbers, spreadsheets on it, do keynote presentations. Those were really good apps right out of the box. They weren't quite on par with their Mac counterpoints when they first came out, but now they really are. And it's phenomenal that they were able to do that, especially given that was a 1.0 product. I mean, what do you think about this evolution, Federico?
Yeah, I was thinking how the first iPad Pro, when it came out, while it was a turning point for the whole iPad line, I think it was not telling a complete story in regards to software, especially when you consider how that was almost a full 2 years before iOS 11, which brought drag and drop and the Files app and proper file manager, but also it was before subscriptions. So even if you consider the business aspect of selling pro software on the App Store, the iPad Pro, while from the hardware perspective, it was telling a compelling story about a bigger tablet with proper multitasking and the Apple Pencil and a keyboard accessory, but it still was not enough, I think, at the time to convince developers that yes, you can actually make pro software for the iPad now. And it took a couple of years, I think, even then, for developers to come around on that idea. And I feel like, especially over the past couple of years, subscriptions, I believe, are going into their third year now. But we have seen that turnaround in terms of developers of existing apps achieving feature parity with their Mac versions. So the Mac version and the iPad OS version more or less have, at least the apps that we use and the apps that we talk about, they have that feature parity today. But also developers have been able to have more flexibility, I feel like, in terms of pricing and trying different things, subscriptions or maybe in-app purchases, and, we have seen folks like the Omni Group, for example, switch to a free trial model with their iPad app. So you can now download Omni Outliner or stuff like OmniFocus for free, and then you can try it for a couple of weeks, and then you can decide to purchase the advanced and the full version. That was not true from 2010 to 2015, even after the first iPad Pro came out. All of this stuff was not in place. And yes, there are still developers who are saying, but Apple should just allow us to do paid upgrades. And I feel like that conversation has been going on forever. And at this point, I don't think Apple is ever going to do that, personally. I think Apple is fine with having these new and different and multiple business models on the App Store. Because if you take a look at all the various options and all the things that you can do, especially with subscriptions, with renewable subscriptions, the things you can do with bundling subscriptions and offering discounts and letting, having a reduced percentage of a reduced cut from Apple in the second year of a subscription. That is a lot that developers can do with pricing tiers and not to mention, again, in-app purchases and all that kind of stuff. So the evolution of the iPad, I feel like, has always been, we need to consider three main evolutionary paths, maybe the hardware, the software, and the App Store as a platform.
This episode of App Stories and our entire week's coverage of the 10th anniversary of the introduction of the iPad is brought to you by Concepts. Concepts is an infinite canvas app for the iPad and iPhone that offers endless idea exploration. The uses for this app are almost as boundless as its canvas itself. It includes things like note-taking, planning, mind mapping, mood boarding, sketching, design plans, storyboarding, graphic design, and illustration. The app is used by companies around the world like Apple, Disney, Illumination Entertainment, HP, Nike, PlayStation, and Unity, to name just a handful. Ink notes and drawings use the beautiful Copic color palette licensed from 2 Corporation, which gives everything a great design look. And the app includes a deep and sophisticated tool set too. You can customize it for left or right-handed users using movable menus, and there's a simple layer system for dragging and dropping when you're editing. And working with grid layouts, shape guides, measurement and scale features enable flexible, precise sketching for everything from note-taking to architectural floor plans, flows, and elevations. The app also lets you drag and drop images straight on the canvas, and you can use professionally crafted object libraries and create your own for quick, efficient sketching during events and note-taking sessions. There's also an automatic presentation mode that works via AirPlay or a cable. Just connect your device to any display for instant live sharing. The app has advanced PDF features too that allow you to edit, create, and sign documents. Finally, you can export to a ton of different formats, including JPEG, PNG, PDF, PSD, DXF, and SVG for flexible workflows between apps and niche software. I absolutely love this app and use it for things like mind mapping and planning big projects all the time. Concepts is free as a basic sketching app with the ability to unlock additional features via a subscription or one-time purchase. To learn more, visit concepts.app and check out the show notes too for a link to download this fantastic app today. Again, that URL is concepts.app to learn more, and go to the show notes to download the free version of Concepts today and start sketching. Our thanks to Concepts. I think you're absolutely right, especially about the hardware in 2015. It's interesting to me that in this second half of the decade, we had hardware, and we still have hardware, that I believe outpaces what's available from a software perspective. I think it's getting there. I think we're finally getting there. And I really do feel like one of the last missing pieces of this puzzle is Apple starting to take a lead on this and giving us apps like Logic or Final Cut Pro or Xcode on the iPad, because I feel like there was such a long period there where Pro apps couldn't get a really good foothold on the platform, that you're right, even after 2015, it took a little while, both in terms of the OS and the pricing models and everything, before we had apps that were really starting to show up on the Pro side on the iPad Pro. And I think it just needs a little bit more of a boost even today.
Yeah, and if you consider before 2015, so the period between 2010 and 2015, when at some point it kind of felt like the iPad that lost its way, or at least that lost the attention from Apple. If you recall, like even things like email clients at some point, third-party email clients, they were frowned upon in the App Store. Or
right.
That, like today in 2020, we have a new category on the App Store called developer tools.
Right.
That is true today, but at the time, it was either frowned upon or just you would get just outright rejected if you try to release a scripting or app or an IDE on the App Store. And things started to turn around with Pythonista and editorial. But even then, the developer of those apps, which are amongst the apps that we're going to cover in another retrospective later this week, the developer Ole Moritz, had a fair share of rejections from Apple and had to resubmit multiple times and appeal the app review board. it's been a bumpy, transition from the iPad as a consumption device, and now this influx of developers coming in and saying, but we actually want to make, this serious productivity software. We want to make scripting apps. We want to make alternative email clients. We want to make alternative browsers. We want to have this, more advanced automation features, for example. The App Store, I think, should be considered as responsible for some of the iPad's limitations, especially in its first 5 years. And I feel like Apple heard that message, and we don't complain. I feel like overall there's still some complaining going on from some developers. Again, as I mentioned, folks who are still wishing for Apple to do paid upgrades, and that all that traditional shareware stuff, if you will. But I feel like overall, the App Store is a much, much healthier and more flexible place today in 2020 than it was in 2015.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And going back again to that original keynote in January of 2010, Steve Jobs introduced the iPad as a device that fit between the iPhone and the Mac. And, when you look at the history of the iPad, it very much was closely aligned with the iPhone at the very get-go, as I said. But when I look at it, I feel like it's drifted towards the other end of the spectrum. It's much more a full-blown computing device like a Mac. It doesn't work the same way. I think it's pretty clear now that Apple doesn't expect or want it to work the same way. But it has a lot more of the features and a lot more of the capabilities, I guess, just implemented differently than the iPhone does, and more like the Mac. So yeah, it's been an interesting 10 years, and I feel like, especially with the way that the iPad Pro kind of got off to a little bit of a slow start, we're still in the early stages of the transformation of the iPad. I mean, we're celebrating this because 10 years is 10 and we have 10 fingers, but I think we're still at least 2, 3, 4 years out from the iPad realizing what we've seen in the last year or two as the vision for what it can be from Apple. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Direct Mail. If you have a business, I bet you're always looking for ways to build your customer base and build a following. And you know what? Email is a super effective way to do that, to reach those people. And for over 15 years, Direct Mail for Mac has been the go-to email marketing app for businesses, nonprofits, schools, and other organizations who want to expand their reach and connect with their customers. It's designed just for the Mac, so you get all of your work done in half the time using the Mac technologies that you've grown to love. Things like drag and drop, keyboard shortcuts, integrations with other apps, and a whole lot more. Direct Mail has eye-catching templates that are infinitely customizable too, and they look great on all devices. Direct Mail has a helpful customer service staff staffed with real people, not chatbots or AIs, just friendly people waiting to help you at no extra charge. Send your first campaign today with a free download of Direct Mail. Listeners of this show will save 10% off of all of their full feature pricing plans. Head over to directmailmac.com/appstories to experience the top-rated email marketing app for Mac and see how they can help your business grow. Again, that URL for 10% off their full feature pricing plans is directmailmac.com/appstories. Our thanks to Direct Mail for their support of the show.
All right, should we talk about the thing that I've been working on?
Yes, because you do all these experiments all year long, and some of them I know about, but I don't know about all of them. And I see a list here, and I want to hear a little bit without spoiling it too much, Federico, because your story is not coming out on Monday. We want to save a little bit of your story for when it's published. But why don't you give us a sense for what you've been working on?
Right. So one of the themes that I've been talking about and writing about, but not exclusively about, like as a standalone story, for the past couple of years, really, is this idea of turning the iPad, and specifically the iPad Pro, into this different kind of modular computer. And by modular, I mean the iPad as a device is a tablet, is a single piece of glass. And the idea would be that with the iPad Pro, thanks to USB-C, so the 2018 model, which I'm still using, it became possible to use that iPad in a variety of different configurations with a variety of accessories and in a variety of contexts. So if you go way back to late 2018, I did a first story called The Many Setups of the 2018 iPad Pro. And in that story, I talked about the smart keyboard and external keyboards, mechanical keyboards, and for the first time, my ultrafine 4K external display. Last year in 2019, I also covered this aspect again, talking about how I was using in my day-to-day work the iPad Pro with an external display and the limitations of the entire system, and once again keyboards, and this idea of, can I use the iPad not just as a tablet, not just as a laptop replacement, but in other contexts as well. And last year in May, the Beyond the Tablet story was published in May. I also covered how I was using the iPad Pro. I finally had figured out a solution for recording podcasts on the iPad Pro. Now, of course, iPadOS 13 came out, and with it brought proper USB access to external devices. And with 13.4, we just got the native cursor with trackpad mode across the entire system. Now, over the past few months, this idea of the modular iPad Pro, it really started to take hold of my brain as a story that I should write about and focus on for the website, because I really feel like we've reached a point where the iPad Pro, as a single tablet, can sort of morph and transform into different types of computer. And it's all possible because of the flexibility of the device. Like when you use a desktop, if you have a Mac Pro, for example, that's all that is, right? It's a Mac Pro. You
Right.
put it under your desk, you put it above your desk, whenever you want to put it. But it's still a desktop computer. And all you can do is connect a monitor to it. And if you have a laptop, you got some more flexibility, but it's still a laptop. So the keyboard can never be detached. And the screen is not touch enabled. You can work with a laptop at a desk or on your lap, but again, that's what it is. And I feel like instead the iPad, and again, specifically the iPad Pro, can become a lot more things depending on the accessories that you use with it. And so in the story, I will go over these different modes. I call them modes. Again, the idea of modularity. And I guess maybe another term for it would be multiplicity. This multiplicity of inputs and different accessories that you can pair with the iPad Pro. And I will go over these different modes that I use myself. Like I will talk about how, despite all of these different setups that I have, I still use the iPad Pro as a tablet, and sort of my best practices and the accessories that I use when I use the iPad Pro as a tablet. I will also talk about the smart keyboard and my heavily modded smart keyboard folio
Right.
with the kickstands and all those things. And I will talk about I guess the meat of the story is the desk mode of, especially now that we have a cursor, the sort of the perfect setup that I've been able to achieve with John, a single keyboard, a single Bluetooth keyboard. Listeners
Nice.
of our Club MacStories exclusive podcast, MacStories Unplugged, will get this reference. A single keyboard that lets me use a single keyboard, a single desk that lets me use the same monitor, the ultrafine 4K display, with an iPad Pro, a single USB-C cable, the same keyboard and a trackpad, and I got my desktop iPad Pro workstation. And I will also talk about apps, of course, apps that take advantage of the external display in fun and interesting ways. And I will talk about music. I will talk about how I listen to my FLAC music collection and how I pair an external DAC, a digital to analog converter, with my iPad Pro to listen to high resolution music with my headphones. It's a bit of a wild story in the sense that I've never properly covered all these different experiments and all these different things in one place. And again, the idea was, let's show readers how the iPad Pro can be more than just the tablet or the tablet with the smart keyboard. Because
Right.
I've been doing all these things. And again, the idea would be there are all these different modes that I use the iPad Pro in every single day. And it's quite amazing how when you really look at each mode, at the core of it is still an iPad Pro. It's still an iPad. It's still a tablet that anytime you can detach and carry around with you. So that's the main idea. There will be some parts that I will save for Clap MacStories, of course, but really I really wanted to cover this because I feel like it's something that I've been mentioning on podcasts and in passing on Twitter, for example, but I've never been able to have it all in one place. So that's my goal.
Yeah, that sounds terrific. You know what for me has really driven home the modularity is the new smart keyboard that we're getting. I guess not smart keyboard, the Magic Keyboard that's coming in May, because it really feels like it makes the iPad a workstation that you would use at a desk. I'm really looking forward to seeing if that works out exactly the way it feels from watching the demos and the ads and stuff. And I'll tell you what I really want, which doesn't exist yet, and I really hope Apple makes it, especially after having seen the Magic Keyboard, is I've been testing this Wacom One, which is an external display for your Mac that's touch enabled, and it has pen input and everything, and it comes with a kickstand. It's 13 inches diagonal. It's about the same size as a big iPad Pro, but on the back on the back two corners it has flip out feet that you can put on a desk, and it sits at 19 degrees. And I have found that it is a fantastic thing to have next to me as I work on my Mac, because I can have GoodNotes, for instance, open and just take a quick note when I'm working in some other app if something occurs to me that I have to do later. It's really a nice experience having that there as an outboard device for my Mac while I'm working, and the angle is absolutely perfect. And I'm sure there are some iPad stands out there that would work with this. I've tried one so far, which I'll probably cover at some point this coming week. But what I really want is something with feet on the corners so that it's really stable and I can lean my hand into it. And I'd love to have that pass-through charging. So I'm imagining something that has a plate that works a lot like the Magic Keyboard part of the stand that hangs over the keyboard section. That would just be a little ramp, and you drop your iPad on there, it would attach magnetically, and you could have a line in to do the charging, and you'd have the line out with the USB port at the bottom of the iPad. So I think there's still a lot that can be done to have new modes created for the iPad, and I'm interested to see what you have to say this week, because I know you've been doing. I've seen some of your experiments, and they're very interesting, especially the DAC one. I find that one fascinating.
Yeah, I mentioned this on Connected last week, how I was looking for a way to fully take advantage of playing high resolution audio from my iPad Pro. So for those times when I want to use apps and I want to multitask and have music going on and control that music from my iPad while still enjoying the high resolution FLAC format. So I've been doing some research. I've been getting feedback from listeners. So that was awesome. I've been doing lots of experiments, and really most of the stuff that I've been trying, I will not cover because it wasn't good enough, or because it just didn't capture my attention as much, or because I just don't use it. So all the things that I will cover are things that I actually do basically every day with the iPad Pro, because the reason that I keep using the iPad Pro is that I really enjoy the ability to switch modes. It's always good to change a change of scenery, like when you work at a desk and then maybe you want to go work in the kitchen and then maybe you want to work from the sofa. Like, I really believe in this idea of being able to change the way you work so that it can be a little productivity boost. I'm a big believer in that. But especially with the new stuff in 30.4 for the trackpad and the cursor, and developers who are already taking advantage of that with their iPad apps, all of that stuff I'm going to cover. There's also I want to mention how this week will not just these 2 stories. We have lots more coming.
Yeah, we do.
There's going to be an accessibility, really, really fantastic accessibility story from Stephen Aquino, who's been working hard on this very special piece for us for the past few months. Ryan, and again, I don't want to spoil too much. Ryan is going to talk about the developer aspect of creating iPad apps over the past few years and how the ecosystem has changed and matured and evolved over the past decade. We are going to round up some of the most important iPad apps of this first decade of iPad. There's going to be a bunch of things. Also, some experiments from you, John, with a different iPad than usual. I think most people are not expecting this story, so that's going to be a nice surprise that you have planned.
Yeah,
and then there's going to be some other team effort in terms of like these collaborative stories that we do with John, Ryan, and I. So it's going to be a busy week, and I feel like despite the circumstances, I think it's we're keeping readers busy. So maybe that's a positive. Obviously. I would very much prefer if the world went back to normal, but we're trying to make the best of the current circumstance.
We are, and this week leading up to this has been a busy one as we're all furiously writing our various assignments, and that has been a nice distraction for me personally, and I'm sure next week will be just as busy. So it's keeping our heads on something and our thoughts on something else, which is kind of helpful for most of the day, and I hope that readers find it a nice distraction as well. Okay, Federico. Well, I'm really excited to be launching this today because it's going to be a really fun week. Everybody, tune in and check out the site on a regular basis because we'll have something for you every day of the week. I want to thank our 2 sponsors again today, Concepts, which is not only the sponsor for this episode of App Stories, but for the entire series of stories on MacStories. So thanks to them, and also thanks to Direct Mail. And of course, you can find me and Federico over at MacStories.net and on social media, where you'll find Federico as @Viticci on Twitter and Instagram. He's VITICCI, and I'm @John Voorhees, JOHN VOORHWS. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.